Good morning, and welcome to Morning Tea with God. This morning, I am going to be reading from Ecclesiastes, which honestly is not that long a book, but I can sadly say I've never read from beginning to end until now. And today I'm actually going to start at the end. I'm going to be going back and forth from the New American Standard, which is what I read from daily. But I'm also going to be reading, good morning, Vivian, from the King James Version. So I'll let you know when I'm reading from which version. So this morning, as I talk about Ecclesiastes, I'm going to start at the end. And the end of chapter 12, verse 13 is where I'm going to start. And I'm going to read from the New International Version. It says, "The conclusion, when all has been heard, is fear God and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person." And as clear as that is, I do think the King James Version shows the importance of this verse just a little more clearly. So the King James Version of Ecclesiastes chapter 12 verse 13 says, "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man." To really understand everything the author of Ecclesiastes is trying to tell us, let's break this one sentence down. Now, there's a couple of key words here. One is we need to fear God, and the other is to keep his commandments. And both of these versions use the same word here for fear and keep. I don't think I've mentioned it before, but when I give you the Hebrew or the Greek, I'm taking that from Strong's Hebrew Concordance and Strong's Greek Concordance, Old and New Testament respectively. Since Ecclesiastes is in the Old Testament, we are going to be using the Hebrew Concordance for today. So, according to Strong's Hebrew Concordance, the word used here for fear is yareh, and it means to respect, to be reverent, a state of being, an attitude. It's not like, good morning, Sarah, it's not like fear, oh my gosh, I'm so afraid. It's in awe of. Webster's dictionary defines being reverent as expressing or characterized by being worshipful. That gives a new outlook on this word fear. To respect, to be worshipful, a state of being, an attitude. The word keep in Strong's Hebrew Concordance is shamar, and it means to guard, as if surrounded by a hedge of thorns, to protect, to save, and preserve. As a child, and if I'm honest, still as an adult, one of my favorite Disney classics has always been Sleeping Beauty. Near the end, Maleficent is trying to guard Aurora to keep Prince Philip from reaching the princess. So she grows this huge hedge of thorns around the palace. The prince must fight very hard just to get through the thorns. This is what I envision as I read the definition of keep. We are to guard God's commandments so intently that others must fight to remove them from our lives. The last section of the verse, "For this is the whole duty of man," shows us that this is what God has mandated we are to do. In other words, this is our purpose. If we insert the Hebrew definitions for fear and keep into the King James Version, we get the paraphrase, "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter with an attitude of respect that is reflected in our lives as we guard his commandments, protecting them continually as if surrounded by thorns, so others have a difficult time removing them from our keeping, because this is our entire duty and purpose." That's pretty clear, pretty straightforward. And as someone who, as I've aged and my children have grown and left the house and I was no longer able to teach, have struggled with, what is my purpose? God, why am I here? What am I supposed to be doing? This one verse takes care of all of those answers. I've spoken often about worship because Scripture tells us over and over that worship is why we were created. Once again, in this Old Testament verse, we're being told that worship is our duty. Worship is our purpose. In the past, when I've read Ecclesiastes, I always believed King Solomon had written the book. While many theologians do believe this is true, many more do not. Regardless of who wrote this, the author had amassed so much wealth that he had the means to pursue happiness and fulfillment any way he wanted. And he did. I'm going to read from chapter 2, verses 10 and 11, and I'm using the NASB. So chapter 2 in Ecclesiastes, verses 10 and 11. "And all that my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. I did not withhold from my heart any pleasure. For my heart was pleased because of all my labor, and this was my reward for all of my labor." Verse 11, "Thus I considered all my activities which my hands had done, and the labor which I had exerted, and behold, all was vanity and striving after wind, and there was no profit under the sun." In verse 10, he's telling us, I've tried everything because I deserve this. I've worked hard. I deserve this reward. Earlier in chapter 2, in the verses 1 through 9, before he says this, he actually lists a lot of the things that he's done. And he did not withhold any pleasure from himself. The preceding verses list some things like wisdom, sex, alcohol, human achievement, wealth. Anything he wanted, he wanted, he either had it or he did it. After all, he worked hard. He deserved it. Does that sound familiar? How many times have you told yourself that very same thing? I know myself, this hit hard. The author was given talents. He was given skills and abilities. And those abilities allowed him to increase his wealth. Instead of revering and worshiping the giver of these gifts, he was worshiping the gifts themselves. Instead of allowing God to lead him and use him as a tool, putting his gifts to work for God's purpose, he used them for his own personal gain. This is what happens when reverence is replaced with self-reward. Before we look too harshly on this man, we need to remember that each and every one of us are also one of God's tools. We should be allowing him to use our gifts and our talents and our abilities in every aspect of our life. In order for that to happen, Christ needs to be the priority in our lives. As the author of Ecclesiastes reminds us, reverence, the attitude of worship, needs to be present as we use our gifts in our jobs, in our lifestyle, in our speech, our public and our private lives should reflect this attitude of worship. All the way at the end of the Bible, since we're starting at the end of Ecclesiastes, let's go to the end of the Bible, the end of the New Testament, in the book of Revelations, chapter 4, verses 10 through 11, and this is also in the NASB. Verse 10 says, "The 24 elders fall down before the one who sits on the throne and worship him who lives forever and ever. They throw down their crowns before the throne, exclaiming," verse 11, "Worthy art thou, our Lord, our God, to receive glory, honor, and power, for thou didst create all things, and because of thy will they existed and were created." The crowns they threw at the feet of God were symbols of their victory, not crowns of royalty like a king or a ruler would wear. They were the crowns of overcomers who were now victorious. The Winter Olympics just ended, and thousands of athletes were represented there. Athletes that spent their entire lives preparing for what comes down to only a few minutes. The victors, those whose preparations earned them the right to call themselves the best, were presented with a symbol of their victory. Today, they are given medals. Originally, they received a crown wreath made from a sacred olive tree that grew in Olympia. Then, as now, the prize symbolized victory. It symbolized glory and honor. And if you listen to the interviews of most of these athletes, they often redirect this honor to those coaches, parents, and other people who played an important part in their journey that took them to this place of victory. This is exactly what the verses in Revelations are talking about. This is throwing down their crown. This is also what I think the author of Ecclesiastes has come to realize. He now understands the truth of it all. Obedience is a choice. Dedication is a choice. Worship is a choice. Taking off our crown of victory, the victory we have only because of the sacrifice Christ made for us, then laying that crown at the throne of God is the ultimate act of surrender and worship. By doing so, we are telling the world that our victories come from God, the creator of all things. Our victories are not by our own doing. We are drawing people's attention away from us and putting the glory back where it belongs, on our Creator, on God, on Christ, the Lamb. I think the author of Ecclesiastes summed up our part of the victory perfectly in chapter 2, verse 11. Thus I have considered all my activities which my hands have done, and the labor I exerted, and behold, all was vanity, striving after the wind, and there was no profit under the sun. He's saying to us that everything he did to find fulfillment, to self-reward himself from money and sex and wealth and wisdom and anything his money could buy, was like trying to catch the wind. Impossible to do. In verse 13 of chapter 12, where we began, the end of Ecclesiastes, it says the conclusion, when all has been heard, is fear God and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. As we come to the conclusion of all that's been heard, this is no longer a question for the author of Ecclesiastes. Rather, this is a question that becomes directed to us. It's as applicable today as it was when the author of Ecclesiastes wrote it. Who do you fear? Not just with your words, but with your choices. Remember, fear means that attitude of worship. So, who do you worship? Not with your words, but with your choices. Who do you give your respect to? What truly has authority over your decisions? Has authority over your time? Has authority over your priorities? Who are you showing reverence through worship? Not only on Sundays, but at your work, in your private life, when you have success, even in your struggles. Every one of us is wearing a crown. The crown of our victories, our abilities, and our accomplishments. But the question is not if we will lay it down. The question is, before whom will you lay it down? Today, I invite you to take that crown off your own head and place it at the feet of one who gave it to us in the first place. I invite you to choose reverence over self-reward, to choose obedience as worship, to live out the truth of fearing God and guarding his commandments is not a burden. It is our purpose. Thank you for joining me with Morning Tea with God. Have a great weekend. Thank you for joining me this morning with Morning Tea with God. I appreciate each and every one of you who come to listen to the message that God has given me. If you felt like this message spoke to you, please like and subscribe below. When you subscribe, you will get a notification when I upload a new video. Morning Tea with God is featured every Friday morning at 9 a.m. with a reminder 1 hour prior to going on live. If you feel led to share my videos, please share the link. And I, once again, appreciate every one of you. Have a good weekend.